Okay, so thank you for attending this session on care for the elderly, the forgotten minority. And in a year when the needs of the elderly, I think, have become very stark, the care homes issue, the difficulty of meeting the ordinary health needs of the elderly population when the NHS is stretched by COVID, the discussion on social care costs. There's been a lot of discussion around the needs of the elderly. So I think this is a really topical conversation to be having. So let me then introduce my panel. So I'm going to go from left to right, and this is the order they're going to speak in. So we're all clear about what's happening when. So let me, I'm going to give them short introductions. There's a much longer biography for them all on the website, which sets out all their very impressive credentials. But I won't read all that out and waste our time doing that here this morning. So we're going to start with Sue Cook, broadcaster. I think still most loved for Crime Watch, if I'm honest. That's the one that everybody springs to mind, but lots and lots of other programmes to her credit, and also novelist. And then we're joined by Dr. Shibli Rahman, and I have to really, really thank him because he's stepped in to the breach to replace our speaker who couldn't attend. So we give him extra special thanks. He's a special advisor on disability, a carer, member of the Royal College of Physicians, and we very much welcome him to our discussion this morning. Then we've got Ed Rennie, Catholic writer, political analyst, founding member of Catholic Voices. I know he's written very widely on lockdown and the side effects of lockdown, and we're really interested to hear his view on this subject. And then finally, we're joined by John Holbrook, barrister, writer for Spiked and The Critic, The Conservative Woman, and he's also written very widely on legal issues, again in this area. So I think we've got a fantastic range of speakers, and without any more from me, I'm going to hand over to Sue to start.
Thank you, Hilary. It's great to be here. It's a fantastic event I've never been to before. So buzzy and full of life. It's really great to be here. In my opinion, lockdown restrictions have done a lot of damage this past 18 months to people of all ages and all walks of life, but in particular to the age groups that I think at either end of society, the very young and the very old. And ironically, the damage to the very old was done in the name of protecting them. And in the attempt of protecting them from COVID, many of them died miserable deaths from lack of exercise, lack of mental stimulation, lack of social contact, and basically utter joylessness. One reason I became super aware of this, I was lucky enough, and still I'm lucky enough, to have a mother who's 102 years old. She lives in her own home. She looks after herself entirely, doesn't have a carer, has all the proverbial marbles. And I became very aware that if she'd been in a care home or she'd had some incident or accident necessitating her going into hospital, things could have been very different indeed. But she's been lucky enough to have me and my brother visiting her every week throughout the pandemic. And in doing so, we were, of course, strictly speaking, breaking the rules. We were risking killing Granny, as Matt Hancock so endearingly put it. But we knew that Mum would be, and she'd be the first to tell you, that what would certainly have killed Granny would have been letting her sit alone in the house every day with no conversation, no dates on her calendar to look forward to, nobody to eat a meal with, and nobody to even make eating worth it, just the doom-laden mainstream media for company. I think that would be enough to challenge anybody's mental health, no matter what their age, but don't get me started on the media. I was on my mettle every Sunday when my husband and I drove down the M40 from Oxfordshire, where we live, to London to see my mum, just in case we were stopped by the police. I was prepared to come out fighting, maybe be arrested if necessary, and I know maybe some people would disagree with my view, but for me, there was no doubt at all in my mind that visiting my mum was the right thing to do, and I would defend it to the death. In fact, Mum says quite frequently that she wouldn't be here today if she hadn't had my brothers and my weekly visits, and I really do believe that's the case. So knowing how lucky our family was to be able to keep a reasonably normal relationship going through the pandemic, It made me realise how very unlucky so many other older people were. Either they had no family at all to visit them, and there were a lot of people actually in that position, a lot of older people, or their family was sticking very closely to the rules and keeping away from them, or they were in a care home, isolated in their room for most of the time and denied virtually any company at all for months and months. And when visits were allowed, it would be to be plonked in front of a window, in front of a screen somewhere, while people you half recognised behind masks jumped up and down and waved frantically at you. They must have wondered what on earth was going on. I think it would affect anybody's mental health. And these visiting restrictions, I gather, are still going on in a lot of care homes, despite government's recommendations. They're not making it law, so a lot of care homes are continuing these restrictions with heartbreaking results. And people unlucky enough to end up in hospital during the pandemic had a terrible time too. I had some direct experience through my sister-in-law, Dee. Her mum was a feisty, artistic woman in her early 90s, lived a few doors away from them, was developing dementia, but she was getting on fine. And then halfway through the pandemic, she had a stroke. She was blue-lighted to hospital, where not only were Dee and my brother refused to permission to visit her, but even when they rang the ward to ask how she was and what treatment she was getting, the doctors refused to tell them in any detail because they didn't have medical power of attorney. I mean, it was just dreadful. Dee's mother must have felt totally bereft, in strange surroundings suddenly, unwell and entirely alone. After a few days there, she simply stopped eating and drinking, turned her face to the wall, and within a fortnight, she died, feeling completely abandoned and absolutely no idea why. I don't think we fully realise yet the extent to which so many older and vulnerable people were abandoned, apparently for their own good. We robbed them of any choice, any chance to decide what's best for them, as if they didn't merit a voice of their own, and all for their own good. We still tend to stereotype elderly people as white-haired, frail things with walking sticks falling asleep in chairs, but that's increasingly wrong. There's no such thing now as a typical elderly person. The older population is as diverse now as any other section of society in terms of income, background, race, gender, mental fitness, physical fitness, and it's growing rapidly too. We've got big problems ahead of us if we don't recognise this. People like me, my husband, my friends and contemporaries, we're in our early 70s now. Some of us are grandparents. I've just stayed with my grandson last night. But we don't feel like we're spent forces. A lot of us would welcome, I think, higher expectations of us and our contribution to life around us. Just living, i.e. not being dead, isn't enough anymore. We need a fresh approach. And I think, I'd be very interested to know if anybody else has got views on this, but I think we need a dedicated minister for the elderly. I actually don't like the word elderly very much either. Maybe we should say a minister for the third age. The relevant minister for the elderly right now is the Minister for Care, Gillian Keegan, and that's a junior ministerial role under Sajid Javid. So she hasn't got a seat at the cabinet table, and her remit is dauntingly broad. I won't read it out to you because it would take too long, but it's very care and NHS focused. And today's older population, I would contend, is about a lot more than just frailty and neediness. There's a huge number of agencies and charities doing really important work in various different aspects of getting older. Economic issues, housing and accommodation, leisure time, right through to end-of-life management and the whole business of planning a good death. So many agencies. I reckon a minister for the third age could bring the expertise of all those agencies to bear on producing a completely well-thought-out, fresh approach, a new approach, coordinated, positive, proactive, and humane. Simply not dying seems to have become a principal goal this last 18 months. But none of us wants to prolong our life if there's nothing but misery and bleak loneliness at the end of it. As a civilised society, we are worth more than that. It's not a matter of spending more money necessarily either. Being humane doesn't cost money. It's our attitudes we need to scrutinise, and attitudes are something that all of us in this room can help to change. We each have a voice, we have influence, we can make our voice heard, and we should.
Thank you, Sue. That's great. Thank you. lovely. Let's hear from you next.
Thank you. Thank you, Louis. My name is Shibli Rahman, and in fact, my biography says I'm a member of the Royal College of Physicians. That is actually a coincidence because my role is as a family carer 24/7, and I live with my mum. She has advanced dementia now, and these issues are very real to me. I was brought in at the relatively last minute, but I'm honoured to be here. And please bear with me. These are some very personal thoughts on where we might go. And I'll start with the WHO definition of 2019 that a society is measured by how it cares for its older citizens. Now, in fact, older citizens are marginally better than the elderly, which is just a homogeneous group above a certain age, bit meaningless like females or males. Or as asked former president of the British Geriatric Society, what does he think or she think? And well, they're hardly forgotten, he or she said, because we look after them in hospital 80 hours a week. And so as far as he's concerned, the NHS has never had it so good looking after the elderly. And social care workers are equally hard pressed, most of them actually battling the intensity of care, which does cost money in addition to gratitude and politeness and good manners. Actual person care does need to attract good staff, and here's the problem. We need to put our money where our mouth is and recognise that people are gifted, looking after relatively vulnerable people in our society. There were some issues that sprung to mind. Lockdown, like rights in general, had two opposing. I'm going to avoid binary viewpoints. As we know, we're trying to present ideas in a relatively open manner without forcing things into pigeonholes. But lockdown was one end which was argued to encourage protection and stop, protect Rennie and all the rest of it. The other issue, of course, was loneliness and lack of social connectivity, and this is a big problem, sense of belonging, community. And in fact, this may seem perhaps trivial, but it's not. It can increase the risk of mental illness and suicidality. And coupled on top of that, a media issue. Of course, my late father said a bad workman blames the floor, so I don't want to head into blaming the media, but the media have some function in our perception, framing the debate. For example, in France, you may know that they took a policy decision not to publish the mortality statistics from care homes, which is quite arguably sinister. Now, I did as far as I got to a master of law, but I'm not a lawyer, I said that. But in terms of rights, I think everyone thinks they know what a right is, but actually, in terms of jurisprudence, it's very hard to define. One of my many roles is an honorary research fellow in UCL, and there used to be a professor at UCL called Ronald Dworkin, who talked about rights as trumps. In other words, rights that gave you a special privilege to do something. But before he died, he published a very important work drawing attention to individual rights compared to rights of society and the organisation. But I'm not a lawyer, and I'm going to stay off that subject. I would like to, the reason I'm here, of course, is you're thinking, oh my God, to get him off. But the reason I'm here is Jenny Morrison and Dan Mayhew launched Rights for Residents September 2020. I'm lucky in that I see my mum every day, and in fact, I need to see my mum every day because she sometimes forgets who I am. Sometimes she thinks I'm Jeremy Corbyn, which even which for me is a compliment of sorts. But I don't look like Jeremy Corbyn, and I just wonder if I didn't see her, how I'd feel about that. And this thing about rights is entirely two-way. That my right, her right for privacy, my right to see her, and all the rest of it. One of the things that got lost many years ago in the debate about dementia rights is whose rights are they anyway? Are they for people with dementia or the carers or even institutions? Because there was a feeling that it was convenient to have family out the way, and I can cope with that. I wouldn't like to be framed as a visitor, rather as a member of the family. Now, in fact, moving horses very quickly before I get myself into hot water, there's an on-running theme and policy called poverty of esteem, where apparently NHS is on par with social care, except it's been like this for 20 years, and all layout and people have been talking about this for 20 years. And the issue is, it clearly hit a roadblock with messaging like, let's protect the NHS. Now, at what expense? Did this mean the care homes were become incubators of COVID? That if you were ill in hospital, asymptomatic even, you could be shunted to care home and nobody would have to do a test. Everything is, of course, easy with hindsight, but to protect the NHS did suggest a little bit like there were some winners and losers in this game. Now,
Can I get you to finish off?
So I'm sure there's loads to talk about, and I'd like to finish now, Libby. But there were issues about discrimination across the board, including blanket bans for resuscitation, and of course a mandatory vaccination for cows, which we might like to talk about a bit later on. But rice is a thing that goes across the whole board, including rationing care for frail people, and I hope we discuss some of these later.
Thank you very much.
so
That's
much.
great. Thank you. Ed, can we turn to you now?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. It's great to be here. It's a US paper, so the statistics won't necessarily translate across exactly. It's from February 2020, and it says 50% of individuals aged over 60 are at risk of social isolation. And I just think that's important, because I think that, picking up on something that was just said, I mean, the point is that there's a huge part of care which is not about wiping bottoms, feeding, combing hair. It's just the company. When my grandmother was very elderly, there were a couple of volunteers that would come and read to her, and I would read to her. And my dad would visit every Sunday and provide lunch for my grandmother. But it was that he was there. It wasn't that he was feeding her lunch, although that was very nice for her. It was the company. I think we're facing a problem in that our values have been affected by the way the passage of time of philosophy, and it's created a different kind of culture where if you like, a foundational principle where that we're all equal and we're all of equal worth, no matter our abilities, our inabilities, our talents, regardless. We talk about equality a lot, but you see with this crisis in care for the elderly that we have, that in practice that's not happening. I just want to mention, and it's very much pre-COVID. There's an article from February 2019 by Giles Fraser at Unheard. Unhelpfully, it's called "Why Won't Remainers Talk About Family?" But it's actually about the social care crisis, as was immediately pre the COVID crisis. So it's a good one to look back at, and I recommend it. But I wanted to go through a very brief story that relates to a friend of mine who was a newly qualified nurse in the 80s. And she saw that a patient of hers who'd broken her hip and had a hip replacement had a urinary infection. She could see this from the catheter. So she put it on the notes that this lady should, I think was in her 80s, should receive antibiotics. And she went away, she was off for a couple of days or something. And she came back and this hadn't been done. So she, kicked up a bit of a fuss about this and said, well, hold on, this has got to be done. I think the next day, or maybe even the same day, she was called in to see the ward sister and the senior orthopedic registrar. And she was very worried when she went into the meeting. She thought, goodness, maybe I've done something wrong, newly qualified, very, in many ways, inexperienced. I thought I must have messed up somehow, goodness me. And she went in, and the senior registrar never said anything, was completely silent throughout the whole process. And the ward sister said to her, now about Mrs. So-and-so and on all this thing, why are you making all this fuss? Why, just leave her alone. Let her die with dignity. And her daughter doesn't want to look after her. Now, she'd spoken to the daughter. The daughter didn't feel able to look after her at home, but had actually found a care home for her at the end of the road, end of her street where she lived, and had spoken about this with her mother, and her mother had agreed. So she knew that this kind of caricature of, well, her mother doesn't really want to look at her. But it was very chilling for her. But of course, it was the senior registrar and the ward sister. So she had no, and she's in her first year, newly qualified nurse, she has no way to appeal this. She's extremely traumatized by this, and it still affects her to the present day. And what happened is that this urinary tract infection developed into septicemia, and she died a very painful death. And I hope that's an extreme case, but that was from the 1980s. And I think many people will know another case, literally the last 2 weeks, a friend of a friend, her mother has been dying of cancer. And when she was no longer able to eat or drink necessarily, quite soon after that, her drip was withdrawn. So no fluids and no nutrients. And she's just died within the last week or so. And that drip was withdrawn a whole month before she died. Now, that recent example and the example from the 80s is just to paint a picture, to say this is a very, very wide and serious problem. And and something Sue said is that not dying it's become about not dying. And that can't be our approach. But also, in the context of COVID, it seems to be that the current policy is, well, you can die of anything as long as it's not COVID. And never mind that you, of course, might well die of loneliness, as has been described. There's a famous experiment on babies that they did, where they were fed and kept nutrients, everything that they would need biologically healthy, but they were not allowed human physical touch. And I think they did it with some babies where they were allowed physical touch and other babies weren't. And all the babies that didn't have any human affection, touch, or anything like that died, even though physically, biologically, they were given all their needs. You can die of loneliness. You can die of lack of the sense that there's someone there who loves you. Because, that's at the heart of the meaning of life. Now, why I mentioned philosophy at the beginning is because what I think is often philosophical concepts and ideas get very popular, and they kind of not dissolve is the wrong word, but they kind of permeate our culture without us really thinking about it. And I think that there is a kind of Benthamite utilitarianism. There's a Friedrich Hayek quote I read actually last night, and he was talking about, we might say, doctors' lives are more important because they can save other lives. We might say politicians' lives are more important than others' lives. And it's a very dangerous way of thinking, because although it kind of has a surface level appeal of a kind of, doctor's life is more important because he can save other lives, it undermines the core principle, our foundational principle that all our lives are of equal value and we all need equal care. And this is particularly pertaining to the elderly because, of course, as people get older, you know, into their 90s and everything, they become less in the sheer instrumentalist sense, and this is why I have a problem with concepts like meritocracy and all the rest of it, is that, and this permeates our National Health Service, is that this idea of where, you know, even if, I mean, that particular case, the reason it was extreme was because she'd had a hip operation and she wasn't dying. But I often wonder about this, my last point is really, I often wonder about the isolation that care homes are now enforcing, because I feel that maybe unintentionally, but there is a sense at which, well, actually they'll just shuffle off and die quicker if we keep their family away. Final point, I once suggested to a very well-respected and a left-wing writer who I very much admire, I won't name him, I said, look, what we need is, if you want to visit your gran, and this was back last autumn, you take a lateral flow test in the morning, and if you're clear, you test negative, you go and visit your auntie, your gran, that afternoon. It's as simple as that. You know, you might wear a mask or something or whatever, but you take your test in the morning, lateral flow, you get a negative, you go and see your gran. Simple. His response was, that's a worthless idea. And that's a really, really clever thinker on the left in this country. Described that idea as absolutely worthless. But that was obviously what we had to do back then. Anyway, I leave it there. Thank you.
John.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Hilary. So, I had the experience a few years ago of having to look for a care home for my mother. She was in her 80s and she was suffering with dementia. And the experience I had was, after looking at about a dozen or so different care homes, is that, broadly speaking, they fall into one of two categories. I'm going to be kind and describe that some of them as good care homes and the others as the not so good care homes. But broadly speaking, the characteristics of these two different kind of care homes were like this. In the good care home, you'd approach it and you'd think, this looks quite appealing. It's well looked after, plenty of outdoor space, which of course is very important for elderly people who may not be able to get out very much. And once you get into this care home, you're greeted by someone who actually makes you feel welcome, knows how to smile, and is more than happy to show you around. And as you get shown around this good care home, you see that there's plenty of interaction between staff and residents. And they're all chatting to one another, they're all smiling and being happy, and the residents are engaged in activities, or some of them are, of course, sitting on their own, but others will be talking to one another. And you're left with the impression that if your circumstances were different, it's the sort of place where you might feel happy to live. So that's the good care home. Now, with the not so good care home, you'd approach it already with a sense of trepidation, because just on looking at it from the outside, it would possibly look dilapidated. It would look like the kind of place where you might not have any space to exercise or get some fresh air. And then on going into this building, you'd be lucky if you were greeted by anyone. Certainly be lucky if the person looked up and smiled at you. And you almost sensed that there was a reluctance to show you around, lest you should see things that they didn't really want you to see. And on being shown around this not-so-good care home, you'd realise that the residents weren't looking particularly happy, they weren't engaging with one another, they certainly weren't engaging much with staff, there wasn't much happening by way of activities, and you were left with a thoroughly depressing attitude of thinking, well, everyone here is just looking at the clock. Either the staff, because they couldn't wait until their shift finished, or because of the residents who were really looking for nothing more than for bedtime to come. And so there you have two different sorts of care home. And when we're talking about social policy, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are the characteristics of a good social policy that would encourage good care homes to develop and the not so good ones to go out of business? And I would say there's three characteristics of any such social policy that we should encourage. The first and most important is that market forces have a very important role to play in this. Now, I know market forces are often frowned upon these days, particularly when it comes to service provision. I don't know why that is, because the truth of the matter is that the best person to look after Granny is either Granny herself, or if she lacks the capacity to do it, her friends and more likely her family. They are people who can make informed decisions if they are able to, by looking at different care homes and deciding for themselves which one is going to be preferable. That is the simple application of market forces. The other aspect of a social policy that we should encourage is the idea that looking after people and generally caring for people and being a carer is a very important aspect of society. And yet we have, over many decades now, frowned upon the notion of caring. We've seen it as something that is not worthy of high pay, not worthy of particular respect or esteem, and hence a lot of good people, good carers, are routinely sort of churned out by the system. They do it, and then after a few years they leave and can move on to more lucrative work, simply because we don't respect them. And how often do you hear people say, well, look at the NHS and look at the care centre, it simply wouldn't be able to operate without a lot of overseas staff. Yes, that's true, but we ought to ask why that is. The truth of the matter is we haven't respected the sector, so we've seen it as an area for low-paid and quite often immigrant workers, and that is not the best way to provide a high standard of care. The third feature that I would draw attention to is how do you regulate this sector? Now, the important point about the operation of market forces is that that provides an important corrective. If you mitigate the effect of market forces, then you are left looking for some other form of regulation. And we have that at the moment with formalised regulation in the sense of the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, which necessarily, I'm not saying it doesn't do a good job, and I think it's important, but it necessarily, because so much responsibility is forced upon it, because of the absence of any proper market forces operating, it necessarily develops a rather tick box mentality. And you cannot make the sorts of informed decisions about what good quality care really is simply by visiting a home every sort of 6 or 12 months or something of that nature, as the CQC does. The other problem that we've had, because our care sector is dysfunctional, is that we have imposed upon it a very heavy-handed legal framework, which is not a framework which is focused on good quality care, which is something I'm afraid lawyers actually fail to understand, because we have forced upon this sector a framework which is related to human rights. What do human rights lawyers understand? They understand the notion of liberty. And so almost everyone who's in a care home is seen, as far as lawyers are concerned, are seen through this framework of liberty. And in a famous case where Lady Hale gave a ruling, she of Spider Brooch fame, she said, a gilded cage is still a cage. In other words, she, like so many other lawyers, looked upon care homes as little better than prisons. They are nothing of that nature. The truth of the matter is, if we really wanted to improve the care that we provide to elderly people, we would focus on good quality care, and we would cast aside all these legalistic notions of liberty. Just very finally, on the reforms which the government has now introduced, I think we should be quite clear about this. These are reforms which are simply about protecting the inheritances of well-off people. They are about transferring resources from the poorer paid to the better off in society. And they have got absolutely nothing at all to do with improving the quality of care for the people who need it. And it's a savage indictment of our political system that the government has been able so far to get away with those proposals.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Okay, so over to you. Can I get people to indicate if they wish to speak, and can we get our volunteers, please, with their roving mic.
Okay, my name is Amanda Hunter. I'm from the campaign Unlock Care Homes, which I began with my co-founder in March this year. After we found that after campaigning for almost a year, there was very little change in realities in care homes around visiting. Over the last year and a half, with families not going into care homes, what has happened is there's been a plummeting in standards. There is huge abuse and neglect, and there are so many problems. I'd like to pick up on so many of the things that the panel have mentioned. Sue Cook, you mentioned hospitals. My experience, I'll just give a brief explanation of where I come from. My mother has Alzheimer's. I was living in Italy until coronavirus struck, and I came over in March last year, originally just to stay a couple of months, to blew over, see my mum, make sure she was okay, visit her, etc., etc. I'm still here. I have fought all that time to get my mum home. And this is one of the things that I feel that is really fundamental about what has happened, is there's been a huge shift in the balance of power between the state and the citizen, and especially between families and care homes and the state. And around hospitals, my mother was admitted to a hospital because she got dehydrated in a care home. And this is another impact of isolation. If you're like my mother, who has Alzheimer's, she is bedbound, she has no capacity, all her needs have to be, seen by the care staff. She cannot express her needs. So she ended up in hospital. When she was in the care home, I was visiting my mother 7 hours a day because she was becoming more and more dehydrated. Staff were unable to give her the drinks that she required. She had so many infections, and my visiting was restricted because I complained about poor care, and then my mother was evicted from that home. She ended up in hospital, and I begged the ward sister to let me in because I knew that my mother's life depended on me being there. She had become so dependent on me for food and fluid that I knew that in the hospital she would not fare well. I was told no, infection control meant that I could not come in. I said, but my mother's end of life, palliative care. Now this is an issue that is really important because in the guidance it says that, and this is the nice definition of end of life, is last year of life. However, care homes and hospitals are not interpreting it in this way. They are saying last 48 hours. So I was told, your mother is not last 48 hours. She's not last days, last weeks, so you can't come in. I explained the situation, Alzheimer's, bedbound, very impacted by isolation. My mum has 3 mantras, well, many mantras, but 3 of them are, I have nobody, there is no one, there is nothing. She was in that home for a year, well, she ended up in 2 homes, but all this time she has been isolated in her room with no stimulus whatsoever. And 1 hour visit from me, this was before the end of lockdown, a week. I took a 7-hour round trip to see my mum. About the hospitals, I wasn't allowed in until 7 days. I was then called by the consultant who said, your mother is now end days, you can come in. I found my mother a very different person to the person I'd left in the hospital, in the nursing home. She was now like a rag doll. However, in the first 30 minutes I was there, she drank 300 mils of fluid. But when I discovered what had been happening, she had been taken off her drip. She had been taken off her antibiotics. When I questioned this, I was told your mother is now palliative care. She cannot have antibiotics. This is invasive. I begged them, and I was told, if you want her to have antibiotics, she will go on the AMBER program, and therefore you will not be able to visit. Luckily, at the end of my battle, I was able to get my mum home that week. It was a 9-month battle to get her home. She's now home, she's putting on weight, and she's far, far better. Care at home is better, far better than care in a care home. But not all families can do that. Not everyone can look after their loved ones at home, and they need support to do that. And this is another really big problem. I think we need new models of care.
Thank you.
Wonderful panel and really, really great points. Firstly, I think it's important we recognise that lockdown kills, and lockdown was the most unhealthy, anti-human policy you could imagine. And we have to ensure that that cannot happen again, not just for the elderly, but for everybody, in terms of not realising that the community, that all of us know best what's best for our family, our friends and our community. Allowing a third party to make those decisions and government is dangerous and will kill people. And I hope that we can get that through to many people. Secondly, I'd really like to know from the panel, how have we got to this situation exacerbated by the pandemic, where we see the elderly as a pain in the arse, as a nuisance, as a problem, entirely problematized. You know, I remember a few years ago, a woman, I don't know if she was a nurse, I think in Norwich, had this wonderful campaign to open a childcare centre within an old people's home. And she had a massive fight to do it, because the idea was the youngsters would be dangerous for the elderly, and the elderly might be a problem for the youngsters. And actually, after 5 years of fighting, she did it, and it was a brilliant success. You know, and people were queuing to get their kids in for childcare in an old people's home for kids that hadn't got a granny. And, you know, very rare, but we need to big up those possibilities, which must be absolutely huge. So, given that it's now cool and politically correct and woke to support the vulnerable and, you know, minorities and the poor, why is it we don't think of the elderly in that regard? Is that what ageism is? You know, because if it's ageism, it seems to me to be the biggest ism out there compared with any other. And on a spectrum from mild neglect to extreme cruelty. And it's a shocking thing that we're capable of. Finally, to wrap up, two things. John makes interesting points about market forces. To be honest, I don't care whether it's private or public. I want to ensure we can have a say and where we want to end our lives and be, or for our family. And secondly, what do the panel think about compulsory jabs for workers in care homes?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, all these anecdotes I have similar. I mean, that the experience of looking after elderly parents, I think, has become, you know, the big problem of anybody probably over 60 or 70. When you've got parents who've, you know, benefited from a really healthy society and can live to their 90s and 100s and actually amazingly well, but then go into a period of steep decline. So I think there are two separate things. One is the quality of life for people who are still independent and able to act for themselves and giving them their possibility of doing that. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is that when people do start in their years of decline, which can be, you know, sudden or slow, and how do you deal with that, and what can society do to support these people? And I think, you know, one of the discussions we need to have is the discussion between the separation between healthcare and social care, because that is a completely false division. I think it's a sort of, when you look at somebody in decline, and my parents are in this situation. My mother recently died. My father is, you know, fading steadily. And, you know, it's interesting to see at the point where he suddenly is seen as being in medical need, he's given all the support. Certainly in Surrey where he lives, it's a good system, given all the support he needs at full cost to the state. And it kind of raises the burden suddenly. Suddenly you've got loads and loads of care in place if you know how to work the system, which we were good at doing. If you don't, it becomes a complete, I feel like must be a complete nightmare for people who don't have access to those kind of services or don't know how to access them. So I think that is, you know, a big issue we need to discuss. But I suppose thinking about why is this happening, I think what people are saying is about utilitarianism and the utilitarian character of the way society tends to operate on a very utilitarian basis. is a real issue. But I think then also beyond that is the culture of fear that we've grown up in. Because one of the things I think, what COVID has brought out is how fear has dominated how a lot of people act. So some elderly people have actually isolated themselves. It's not just the government isolating them. It's deeper than a government issue. It's an issue of the way the way our culture thinks about the risks we face and how we deal with those risks. And I think one of the biggest challenges we face is how do we challenge that, if you like, that cultural fear? How do we persuade people that the worst thing in the world is not getting ill, which is kind of what people are saying now around the COVID. I have conversations with people my generation, and they say, well, I just don't want to get ill. And you just think, if that's going to how you live your life, then that is, in a way, the underpinning problem, the sort of refusal to really consider the balance between getting ill yourself and how we treat people who are much frailer than ourselves.
I'll try and be as brief as possible. I totally support your idea of having a minister for the elderly, and I think it's only a matter of time before it's done. Did we have a minister for loneliness at one point, or do you still have it? Some years ago,
Scotland has one, but
yeah. I can only say that the experience in care homes I've had, they instituted a system of visits, which I've availed myself of, that basically if you go into the home, you have a lateral flow test, and if all's okay, you get to visit the person. It's all booked in advance. It works quite well. So it's not all bad. The children's centre, having children and elderly together, that particular care home I'm thinking of does have that. In fact, they're a pioneer. They've got a nursery at the back. It was there beforehand, and what they've done is bring the children in, and it has a very positive effect on both of them. They get a granny, they get surrogate grandchildren, so it is known to work. I've got some other things to say, but I might collar people individually afterwards. Okay, so
Thank you. I'm going to take one more contribution, then I'm going to come back to the panel.
A provocative question and then a philosophical question, but the provocative question is a genuine one. I'm not just trying to wind people up. If a family has the means to look after their elderly parents and they don't, instead they look to a care home to do that, is that selfish? So it's a question about our broader value system, and do we need a change of values? The second question is, I think, a philosophical question. I thought all the panel's points come from different angles were really interesting, but John, your 3 points, can I ask you a question about the first point and then the last point? So you said we need market forces here to basically solve the problem. And then later on, you had a pop at what you call legalistic solutions. You said that wasn't going to solve the problem. Convince me that market forces will solve the problem of how we look after our elderly. Because when I think about things like family, care, love, duty, community, those types of values, I see market forces as very empty, as very valueless, and ironically almost utilitarian instrumentalist, cold in this context, in this discussion. So convince me that I'm wrong, because I think the answer to trying to have a better approach to how we look after our elderly doesn't lie in the element of market forces. It lies in the need for a philosophical conversation about how we can perhaps arrive at a new and better value system.
Great. Do you want to start off, John? As that's a question directly for you. Just 1 minute, please, each from the panel, and then we're going to come back out.
So on the issue of market forces, I tend to look at it like this. If what I mean by market forces, I'm using that as a synonym, really, for empowering family members to make decisions. Because family members are the people who are best placed to decide where granny or mum should live. They are the people who know what sort of environment... the first decision to always be made, by the way, is whether or not he or she should be in a care home. And for some people it's not right, for other people it is right. Who, first of all, is in the best position to make that decision, assuming granny doesn't have the capacity herself? It's got to be family members. They are the people who know that person. They are the people who have her best interests at heart. Now, there's only two ways of resolving all of these questions. You either empower the individual and empower the family, which means that you have a system which is largely based around market forces, or you don't. And if you don't, then you are handing that responsibility over to the state. And that leaves me cold, because whenever you hand responsibility for a decision over to the state, you end up with a pile it high, sell it cheap approach. That is inevitably what is going to happen when the state is spending someone else's money. The state is going to be concerned with cheapness. It is not going to be primarily concerned with quality. Now, you're quite right to talk about the importance of values, which I did also talk about in terms of the importance of caring. But I actually think, and if you look at all the good care homes that I was talking about earlier, you will find that they are good largely because they are able to recruit, train and keep good quality carers. In other words, all of their staff are instilled with the important values of respecting and valuing people that we need. If you go to it doesn't, by the way, it doesn't matter whether the home is private or state, most of them are private. But if you have a private care home where most of the residents are placed there by the state, I'm afraid you are going to be looking at carers who are just watching the clock, waiting until their shift finishes.
Thank you.
Ed.
Yes. Firstly, just to say to Amanda, thank you, and very moving, the bravery and persistence of what you did. I'm sure there's lots we could talk about, but I just wanted to thank you for sharing that very important story that you told. And obviously, I think it's particularly important that there are those who were not in a position to do what you did. And I hear stories about that quite a lot. I just wanted to, ageism was mentioned. Absolutely, it's ageism. The two prevailing prejudices of our culture, I think, are lookism and ageism. So if you're not familiar, lookism is beautiful people are more valuable. You might have noticed that in our society developing over the last 30 years. But ageism as well, and they're actually linked, because old people are very beautiful to my mind, but not the kind of beauty that we're talking about in terms of lookism, and it's a real thing. But in short answer to how did we get here, it's that all these different philosophical traditions, these political traditions that have developed over time, have all undermined the fundamental values that we need to have, which is human solidarity and human liberty. You can't favour one over the other. You have to have those in tension. And we kind of have a very, very surface level belief in equality. I mean, actually, the way you guarantee equality is through the liberty and solidarity, in my view. And ultimately, our guiding principle has to be love, human love, that every human person deserves love, deserves to be loved. And you only default from that if you're, say, convicted of murder or all the rest of it. Our foundation principles, we are losing. We have been losing them. I just think on the question about selfish, are they selfish? Just short answer, no, but let's chat later about that. And just, I think there's a problem with what John is saying. I agree with in terms of there needs to be choice, there needs to be an alternative, and families need to be empowered to have that alternative, whether it's bringing their elderly relative home or whether it's finding a better care home, and how you can strengthen those care homes that are better. The problem perhaps that I might have with John's view is that you can, at the moment we have market forces, and at the moment we have a powerful state and powerful private care companies. It's the private care companies that are enforcing these care rules. You also, with the profit motive, you also get the same things that you do with the state, which is the desire to cut costs, the desire to say, well, we don't want these people visiting their relatives because they're the guarantees that the care is good. My friend who's that nurse, she said, people just say, oh, but if I kick up a fuss, will they treat my gran worse? And she says, no, kick up a lot of a fuss, because it means they'll take care of her better, because they know you're going to be a big pain in the arse if they don't. That's why they don't want you in the care home. That's why they don't want these visiting rights, is because they have to work harder at caring. And that's not to belittle. There must be some absolutely amazing carers who've been very heroic through this whole process. So I don't want to besmirch all carers. But obviously that is a culture that's increasingly pervading our National Health Service and our social care system.
Thank you.
Yes. So many excellent points. Thank you. I'm only going to take 3 of them. Market forces. I don't want to annoy people. No one opinion is correct. But Tony Benn famously said, whenever I look at a cardboard box in London, I think of market forces. So there are other viewpoints. My issue with market forces is a confusion, in fact. I think potentially it can be a good thing. Don't bug the market and things will reach an equilibrium. The problem is that due to creative tax accounting, some of the profits don't end up in this country and go abroad. And so, on top of that, the lowest paid get lowest paid. Now, you can argue that we should be protected more by collective bargaining, or you can argue it's a problem in immigration. I'm not going to go there. Okay. Now, the second point is Amanda's excellent point. I can't. By the way, in general, my viewpoint is not representative of either the medical regulator or the Royal College of Physicians. This is a personal point. I can't refer to individuals' care, and I can't give specifics. One thing to say is that generically, people with dementia are at risk of a condition called delirium, which means that if they stop eating or drinking, get an infection, they kind of get a very acute change in behavior and cognition. This is a medical emergency, and unless you have somebody to spot it, it does look a lot like end of life, by the way, and it needs medical treatment in the hospital. So if you're going to run a skimpy workforce who doesn't recognise who don't, pardon my language, don't recognise them, you're going to run into problems. Thank you, Amanda, for bringing that up. I'd like to perhaps have a chat with you later, if I may. But it's an important generic point, nothing to do with one individual case. I worried about these social isolation, yeah. Connectivity, yes. People at homes, yes. Mortality, yes, but one of the factors is actually delirium. People at home not being recognised as being severely ill and prematurely dying. Third point is how we got here: recruitment, workforce shortages. We had 2013 Health and Social Care Act, which actually did move things on further, but NHS England did care planning, shared decision making, none carer support, it's all slogans, no real action, work in progress. Thumbs up, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Sue?
Well, yes, you mentioned the words medical emergency, and that raised my hackles, because I think a lot of the cruelty that's been done in the name of lockdown for this last 18 months has been under the name of this is an emergency. The whole COVID emergency law was rushed through Parliament. Nobody really had a say in it. It's given people an excuse to be tyrannical, autonomous, authoritarian rather. And I think, Amanda, you said that you noticed that there was a big shift from sort of families and individuals to the state. And I think it's been really dangerous. I think it's going to be really hard to turn it round as well. I mean, the way you were treated in hospital, it had me nearly in tears. I just think it's absolutely appalling to treat people like that. And we saw footage, didn't we, of people whose mother was in a home and she wasn't being looked after properly. This woman tried to get her out of the home to take her back to her own home where she'd been looked after. And she was arrested, you know. That's right, yes. And seeing these things, it's seeing these things that over the last 18 months that has woken me from my complacency, certainly, and this is why I'm here, you know. You were going to say something, Amanda?
Sorry, yes, it was about families' rights, and I have lasting power of attorney over health and welfare. It means nothing. When I was saying I want my mum to be discharged home, and I said, well, I have lasting power of attorney, they were wanting to send her to her third home in 3 months. I was told it was irrelevant. My lasting power of attorney was irrelevant.
Okay, we've got lots of people to speak. Can I come back to the floor again?
All right. I wanted to address your point as well when you were saying to the panel, how have we got to this state? And I think it's been a lot of hypocrisy as well, really along the lines of what I was saying. It's a lot of hypocrisy. It's all been for their own good. It's, you know, we mustn't let them meet people. You know, families might want to meet their elderly people, but no, for their own good, they mustn't. And so they've suffered terribly. And we all know that love, the touch of a loving hand, is worth a million tablets. And that's really how I think we got to that. And also you said, what do we think about compulsory jabs? And I don't think anything should be mandatory. I think it should be. So that's the short answer to that, because I know you want to get back.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there's no exaggeration to say that we're actually facing, in huge numbers of care homes around this country, permanent lockdown forever. There is no end in sight to it. And that, from my own experience and from the experiences of a lot of people I've met through the Unlocked Care Homes group, we're not talking about what happened during lockdown. We're talking about what is going to happen in the future. You know, last weekend I was supposed to. My mum lives quite a long way away in her care home, so I have to travel quite a long way to get there. I was supposed to go and visit her last weekend. On the Friday, the care home phoned me and said, "Well, we've had a few snuffles." They're in Yorkshire, East Yorkshire, so they talk about COVID instead of COVID. But we had a few snuffles and a few symptoms, and so we've done some tests, and we're going to have to wait till the test comes back. And in the meantime, there won't be any visitors allowed. So that's my visit cancelled, and that my 30-minute visit, as it would have been, where I have to do a test before I go in, put full PPE on, sits about as far away as you are, with from my mother, with somebody, the receptionist, sitting behind her, making sure that I don't get too close. You know, my mother hasn't been able to touch her latest great grandchild. You know, it's just appalling, and there's no end in sight to it. And I think that needs to be really emphasised and really publicised as much as we possibly can.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just on the market forces thing, I thought it was a very interesting point, because I think the problem in some ways is that elderly people are not contributing to society, and that there's this fundamental problem whereby you're expected to be contributing to society constantly under our system, and that undermines the sense of moral equality that I think is absolutely right. And one of the things that struck me that is where this is expressed is in quality of life, years added. Anyway, however it works. That's
Quantity adjusted life years.
Quantity, thank you.
That's even worse.
And yes, I think that's a problem, because you cannot measure the worth of a human life. And this is the problem that exists in our system, is that we're forever trying to measure exactly, how many relevant life years does this person have? And so therefore, how valuable is their life? And of course, that's a ridiculous way of doing things. So we cannot measure these things constantly, and that is the fundamental problem. And it strikes me that one of the problems that is being registered in the Netherlands at the minute, they have legislation going through to offer euthanasia to all people over 75. And that's a sort of a very blatant expression of the fact that they do not value people over the age of 75. And I think that is fundamental to our society, and I just wonder what the panel thinks about that.
Great discussion. Very briefly on Sue's point about a minister for the third age or whatever. I mean, I don't think ministers can solve this. But if I was going to have a minister, I'd have a minister for the study of intergenerational relationships to see not just what's happened in the past, but what's going on in the future. I guess my main point is to try and take this a bit to the future without being utopian or whatever. But it sort of stemmed partly from some of the things that John said about market forces and stuff like that. So I know it's not what John was arguing or his main point, but in some ways you could say that genuine market forces don't actually exist in the UK at the moment. I mean, we live in a very distorted economy. Part of the past couple of years, I've taken Amanda from Cambridge across to Ellesmere Port, had a lot of time to think, and I started thinking about the actual background, economic and physical fabric of the UK. You know, it's clapped out houses, whatever. Again, what John said about there's good care homes and there's bad care homes. I wouldn't want to live in a good care home. You know, I know in Europe, say, there's lots of examples, I guess, of communities or whatever. I don't know, but to a certain extent, what I'm trying to say is the needs to, it's a bit distance from this issue about people campaigning and what's going on now, but thinking more about the future, about changing almost the economic and physical fabric of the UK. You know, it's a difficult thing to start off with, but to me, you've got economics, you've got politics, and you've got society, those three things. But looking at it a bit from the economic side of point of view and the future, which all connects the others, it'd be good to start thinking about, there's productivity to generate the actual wealth for what's going on now, but there's also the fact that, you know, we to a large extent, you know, UK is they're old houses, you know, they're not suitable for people to have people at home. You know, you're lucky if you've got a granny flat or whatever, or you can have an extension. But we need to start thinking about the actual fabric of the UK as a modern society for the future. And then the things like market forces and all of the other things may come out. I know it's a bit future oriented, but I think, you know, people in here are interested in all these things, and it'd be quite good if people could start thinking about that as well, because it may clarify how we get from where we are now to seriously improving things in the future.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got somebody at the back, yes?
Hello. A core point that unites a lot of what people have been saying on the panel and elsewhere is about the importance of individual agency, individual moral agency, the ability of old people themselves to make their own decisions and have those respected, but also the ability of carers themselves to come to their own ethical judgments. I want to address something which has just barely come up, which is mandatory COVID vaccination for care workers, and of course it's coming in the NHS as well. Does the panel agree with me that the real impact of that is to morally cripple the carers themselves? Because essentially let's take it back to essentials. Free and informed consent to medical intervention is a core principle of medical ethics. If we have, as we already have in the care sector, mandatory vaccination, particularly mandatory COVID vaccination, which has its own issues, but also mandatory flu vaccination, if you have mandatory vaccination, what that means is that you are left with a workforce which is made up entirely of people who fall into one of two categories. Either they have been subjected to unethical coercion and they have knuckled under, or they have been silent as their colleagues have been subjected to unethical coercion and knuckled under. Now, both categories, I suggest to you, are morally damaged. People who fall into both of those categories are in fact not competent to make effective ethical judgments. Therefore, the entire care sector is staffed exclusively by those who are, I'm very sorry to say it, morally unfit to do so. And that is a direct consequence of government policy. Does the panel agree with this? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, hello. I'm going to admit that many years ago I was the manager of care homes for people with mental health problems rather than the elderly. They were well resourced relative to many of the old people's homes. It was to do with the closure of the big psychiatric hospitals. I worked for a not-for-profit. The staff were paid well above the minimum wage, which came in during the time I was working there. And what I would say is the idea that you couldn't have outsiders coming into that care home would have been dreadful, because although I was the manager there, and I would say, given I had a well-resourced care home, well-trained staff, my care homes were good ones. And the people in them most of the time could express themselves. But the difference, that the number of times that the staff would say, oh, we need to look at that. What would so-and-so's brother say if they came in and saw that? What would so-and-so's daughter say if they came in and saw that? So then you get, that is a constant thought. Nobody ever said to me, oh, what would the inspectors say if they came in? That was me saying, if I haven't got this paperwork done, what are the inspectors going to say? But nobody ever brought that up as a care issue. But family coming in was really important. And that was a good care home. And I think the idea that there would be people, the homes where nobody was doing that, nobody was thinking that. And I think then you get a culture, and the culture changes. If you don't have a constantly questioning culture, that's when you start getting the really bad care homes. And that is separate from the idea of profit, because I do think that market forces are not good. And if your focus is profit, which in most places are, if your focus is profit, there is a balance between profit and care. So where profit's concerned, you are not going to use that to get good care. The other point, on a pragmatic basis, that I would say, outside of the situation at the moment, which is very extreme, hopefully we will go back to something else, but from a pragmatic point of view, in terms of how do we make things better in care homes, I would say that the concept of looking at things from the outside is what's going to make it better. And in my experience, moving staff around to other care homes and experiencing the practice in the other care homes was a really good move. And I can say people don't go to other care homes, look at the practice there, and then bring back bad practice. They're more likely to question the practice in another home, because they're not invested in the same way, they haven't got the personal relationships, and they're probably not going to lose their job if they question in another home. So actually they're going to take good practice, put it into that home, and then they're going to think and bring good practice around. So if I was looking at policy, I would be looking at a policy of trying to move staff around as part of a training process in order to level up the practice. Because I never saw people come back and bring bad practice back. They would only come back and bring good practice or questioning.
Great,
That
thank
was
you
my
very
thought.
much, thank you. We talked quite a lot about this issue on market forces, and I guess one of the things I would question is that where market forces does seem to have led us is to many care homes being owned by venture capital companies who are, very, very profit focused and don't necessarily seem to be at all care focused. Kind of feels to me that, there's room for state intervention, which is not a kind of financial intervention, but is more about a kind of social contract intervention that says, in the care homes we have an agreed level of pay and training that any care home that's used by the state has to provide that level of pay and training for its staff. And that kind of feels to me that that's kind of intervention you need rather than a financial one. And I agree that the current settlement does seem to be entirely focused on, letting rich people keep their houses than about funding a care sector at the level that it needs to be funded. Amanda, then we're going to come back to the panel.
Very brief. Two things. I totally agree with the lady who's just spoken. I also agree with you, Hilary. I think that moving forwards, we need new models of care, though. There will always be a need for care homes. I don't think that the market is able to provide the level of care that it's not just elderly. In our campaign, we've got parents of children who have been locked up. We've got wives not able to see their husbands, etc., etc. And that won't change. And I think that market forces is not the way. We need the state to take back control of social care. However, it should not be bureaucrats making the decisions. I agree with John that, families are the best people to decide the care of their relatives. However, that power is not being given to families. And as I said, when your lasting power of attorney, and I'm not a unique case, is you're told it's irrelevant. And I think, in the hospital, I was told that you can't go in because of the Coronavirus Act allows each hospital trust and each care home to make their own decisions. and they will lock people out. And for the reasons that you were saying, they don't want families in because families see bad care.
Thank you.
When we're talking about the free market, yes, you can talk about the morals of the free market, etc., etc. What I was talking about with the distortion of the free market is something that's almost invisible. There is not a free market, for instance, in, say, building houses. And this is, where you can build them, etc. And this is causing the fundamental underlying distortion where property is not seen as somewhere to live and actually depreciates. It actually gets more expensive the older and whatever it is. And that, to me, is the big underlying thing where even with a care home, the care home property, good care home property, that most of what they're spending is paying the mortgage on it. So this leads through to all of the other low pay, etc., etc. So when we talk about the market and economics, we need to bear that in mind. And the UK has got a fundamentally distorted market economy, whether you're for it or against it, and this needs to be recognised.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for everybody's contributions. I'm going to come back to the panel now. 2 minutes from each of the panel. Sue, can we start with you? Thank you.
I think one thing that might address what a lot of people have said, I know you said you didn't think a minister was a very good idea, and maybe the minister isn't a good idea, but you need some agency with authority that will... I just made a list very quickly, very easily, 15 different agencies and charity dealing with totally different aspects of ageing. National Care Line, Ageing Without Children, which is a big area, Campaign to End Loneliness, Later Life Training, and I won't read it all out. But if you brought all those agencies, which are all acting on their own, presumably funded by charities, having to fundraise and spend a lot of valuable time raising awareness, if you had some agency that would take over bring to bear all those influences and all those aspects, I think you could really do some good. And it might not be a ministry, but I think somebody at the cabinet table would be good. And somebody who can, you don't need lots of money when you've got all those resources all satelliting about. Bring them under one agency, one aegis, and do something positive. And I think I would just also like to say that Wendy mentioned fear, and I think a lot of what we've been through in the last 18 months has been because when people are frightened, they fall back on rules. Mandatory jabs, masks, social distancing, no hugging, and if you're seen doing any of those things, no hugging somebody at a funeral, no visiting people in hospital, letting people die alone, allowing people to say goodbye to their relatives at funerals, all those things, all because of fear, which kind of feed into authoritarianism and people being little tyrants or people just feeling they've got to do what they're told. The thing about rules is that by definition they lack humanity. You need nuance. We need people's humanity to be brought back and forget the blooming rules. Sorry.
Don't apologise. That's fine. That's great. Thank you. Last 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think the issues for me broadly come into four tranches: market forces and 2, economics; 3, law; 4, culture. Market forces, I mentioned Tony Benn about the cardboard box, because actually market failure is a problem. If a care home goes out of business, it is a problem. For doctors and nurses and care staff, it is a problem. But to continue to care, become discontinuous, who's going to watch over the clients and patients? So if markets have to run well, according to Section 172 Companies Act 2006, directors are meant to give enlightened shareholder value, have due regard to corporates, to society, corporate social responsibility. Of course, there's no actual enforcing of this, so if you put it in a tax haven, it becomes irrelevant. Number 2, economics. I've addressed that before with low wage and other aspects of that. 3, law. Well, the regulation isn't enough, is it? Because if you have a rules-based philosophy, then you rely entirely on the rules. Mandatory jabs. Now, if you were to make them mandatory, then you could be vaccinated, sure, you could lose the workforce problem, then you can have the Delta virus still handed over to somebody despite your mandatory virus. And number 4, it abolishes autonomy. It goes on to curse of territory, which is a really big problem. And 5, you think, well, because I've had my mandatory jab, I don't need to wear PPE, I don't need to come right up to somebody's face sneezing. So there are problems with mandatory jabs as well. And my 4th point, culture. Fish head rots from the head down. Now, if we've got poor leadership, I'm sorry to get all work on you. If you've got poor leadership, you're going to run into problems. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Ed?
Yes, I want to draw on the point about the future and the point about accountability. I think our staff member who was making a contribution about, I think the power of the state is the large part of what's got us into this mess. Okay, so where does the accountability come from? It comes from the families. Yeah, and this is why the whole structure, what you were talking about, the whole structure of the political economy and civil society it's completely broken across the Western world. Maybe worse in America, maybe slightly better here, but it's broken, and it's and that is because we have a lack of trust. So, and I think I think individual autonomy is really important, and in terms of the compulsory vaccinations, that's absolutely right. But also what's fed into our culture is individualism, and an ultra-libertarian individualism feeds into the need for a stronger state, because you don't have those civil bonds in the culture which regulate behavior and which regulate everything we do. So the accountability, of course, you do need the state to be there to enable things, to ensure minimum standards at work and all the rest of it, some of the things that Hilary was mentioned. But the ultimate arbiter in 99.9% of the cases has to be the family when it comes to care of other family members. And if we look into the future, that is the one thing we need to be resolutely focused on. Just so glad you talked about grandchildren. Really, what is the most emblematic thing of this fear that we've got? A fear, by the way, permeated by the state, propagated by our government, permeated by the state. Maybe understandable at the beginning, but should not be the case any longer. And the life-giving experience for grandparents to meet with their grandchildren, particularly when they're still children. You know, it really is absolutely vital, and that was cut off for so long, and it's still being cut off, and maybe cut off for longer, is just absolutely tragic. Again, on vaccinations, I mean, lateral flow tests, and then if you test positive, a PCR test to confirm it. Why is this, if people aren't willing to take the vaccines for very good reasons, why isn't that happening? And just
very quickly.
No, I had another final point, but I can't remember what it is, so there we go.
Joe.
So my view is that you either empower the individual or you take power away from the individual. And if you're taking it away from the individual, you are necessarily handing it to some other body, which is the state in one of its many different guises. I don't think there's been an argument against empowering the individual. We heard from someone to my right that if you bring something under state control, you increase democratic accountability. Really? I mean, I just think you just have to look at the history of so many different societies to find that is simply not the case. If you want to increase and improve standards, then it is only the individual who can drive up those standards. Now, that isn't to say that the state has no role to play, and I agree with Hilary on this point, which is that when it comes to care, the state does have a very important role to play. I touched on that when I raised the issue of immigration, which I notice no one has come back to. What I'm talking about there is the role that the state can play in making sure that the market operates properly. And if you allow the market to import a lot of labour because it's cheap, then you will have a very damaging impact on the care sector. That's the sort of responsibility that the state should assume responsibility for, and also, of course, training. And generally driving up respect that society ought to have for people in the caring sector. Now, just finally on this issue, which I think is very important, and it relates to what I'm talking about, the importance of the individual. I think that the gentleman at the back spoke very persuasively about the issue of moral autonomy and the fact that in a few weeks' time, a number of carers are going to lose their jobs because they morally object to being injected with what's called a vaccine, but which many people with good reason will refer to as an experimental treatment, and in which no one knows of the long-term consequences. Now, whatever you think about the vaccine, we surely have to respect the right of individuals to say no. And it is quite wrong that people are going to be driven out of this care sector because they have said no to the vaccine. That, by the way, also demonstrates the lack of respect that society has for the people working in this sector. Because if we respected them, you would never get the state treating doctors or medics in the same way. I know it may come in actually with the NHS now, but they initially they initially went for care workers because having established the precedent with care workers who are not respected, it can now spread to other sectors. And I think it is fundamentally wrong that the state is assuming responsibility for coercing people to have a vaccine.
Thank you. Thanks to our speakers, our volunteers.